The movie trilogy, for as long as I can remember, has held the same formula of the good one, the great one, and the what happened. Every trilogy you can think of has that weird rhythm to it. That third movie is always so different. It's almost like it doesn't need to be there at all. A lot of movies really only need about 3 hours to tell a complete story, so why even go past part 2 to begin with? Ever since the era of the Dollars trilogy, the Godfather trilogy, and the Star Wars trilogy, there's been a set bar for what a movie trilogy is supposed to do. This is visual storytelling, and sometimes it takes 3 movies to get that story's point across. Very rarely is it only a 2-movie story. But starting around the time blockbusters became a thing in the 80s, late 70s, you could bet your bottom dollar that if a movie had a sequel, there was gonna be a threequel. Hate that word, by the way. Sequel just sounds so much better. But the threequel has become a movie-making necessity for telling more of a story and making more money off of said story. You would think that the movie trilogy started because the story was actually just too big for one movie or even 2 movies. The earliest example of a movie series being too big for 1 or 2 movies I can think of is Star Wars. Episodes 4, 5, and 6, while this true 3-part trilogy was telling one story surrounding Luke Skywalker, the story was cut up into 3 episodes. The fact that these movies are subtitled as episodes helps to prove that movie trilogies are often just long-winded 3-part episodes. Steven Spielberg actually leaned into this with the Indiana Jones movies. You can't really call Indiana Jones a one-story trilogy. Each movie kind of stands on its own as its own movie. Despite what you would think a trilogy is supposed to be, the majority of them seem to just be 3 separate episodes happening in the same universe. This was apparent with the Dollars trilogy from the 60s. It doesn't actually seem like a trilogy because each movie can be seen as a separate spaghetti western film. They just all happen to have Clint Eastwood as the main character. With trilogies like The Godfather and Mad Max, these were also episodic in sense, especially the third movie. That third movie has always just kind of stuck out like a sore thumb or whatever. As trilogies were starting to come up in this era of the blockbuster, it was established that the first 2 movies are often a part 1 and part 2 to a story that didn't need any more explanation. But because of the popularity and hype of those 2 films, a third movie would be made, even if that third movie didn't keep up with the same pace as the first 2. It was more apparent that people wanted to see more of these characters and creatures and didn't care if the essential story had already been completed. This demand for more movies bounced back to the film studios as a way to create franchises and more money. Perfect example is Steven Spielberg with Universal. As a creative consultant for its first theme park in the 80s, it was his movies that pretty much made the theme park what it is. Like you would get maybe a Jaws t-shirt and see an E.T. animatronic, while Spielberg would sit back and get like 2% of all the ticket sales back into his pocket. It's kind of like how a TV show needs a certain amount of episodes to go into syndication. A film series basically needs 2 to 3 movies to have that long-running franchise potential. And of course, we have the exceptions to the film series, like E.T. and Snyder's List, but the franchise in question is really just Spielberg's movies. But back to the TV show comparison. In the same way that the middle to last few seasons of a TV show tend to not be that good, it's the same way with a film series. It starts off pretty good, then often it gets better with part 2, but then that part 3 is just kinda there. Like Back to the Future Part 3 and Army of Darkness, for example. Were those movies really necessary? The first two were already perfect. Same with Mad Max. You often had that first movie, which in the 70s and 80s was often really unique. It was a film that could change your perspective on movies and life as a whole. Most of the best films ever made, and I stand by this, came out during the 70s and 80s. And not too long after that first movie came out, give it 2 years usually, a sequel would come out. And the sequel was a big deal. It meant the first movie did well. Viewers wanted more. It was guaranteed that the sequel would be bigger and better. It had to be, because the first part of the story had already proven to be profitable and worth making. The sequel would often get a bigger budget. Maybe it would just have an actual distribution company behind it instead of just being independent. That second movie is often the highlight of the whole series. It's often the movie we think of when we think of the series. When people think of the first Star Wars trilogy, they're usually thinking of Empire Strikes Back. When they think of Mad Max, they're thinking of the second one, when it went full-on apocalyptic punk rock. Evil Dead is a cult classic people still remember because of Evil Dead 2. Back to the Future is what it is, really, because of the sequel, where they actually go to the future and back to the past, and then back to 1985. That third movie was basically just a brand new story, probably low-key made to be a long-winded TV spin-off pilot. Same with Army of Darkness. Point is, the first two movies of a trilogy, 99% of the time, are the best parts of the trilogy. And it's been like this ever since the film trilogy was a thing. And Return of the Jedi might be one of the only exceptions to this rule. So after decades of Hollywood establishing the bar of what a movie is and can be, filmmakers of the 1990s already have this idea that if they can make one good movie that makes a lot of money, they should make a part 2. And if that goes well, make a part 3. Writers and directors of this era like Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino would find that their whole career would take off after their second movie. Rodriguez's first big movie was 1995's Desperado, and this was technically a sequel to the lesser-known El Mariachi, his first movie. Tarantino, of course, blew up after 1994's Pulp Fiction, and while this was no sequel, it was still his second movie. There's just something about the second attempt. They say third time's a charm or whatever, but if you know what you're doing, you will get it right on the second try. In the animation genre, 1995's Toy Story is a modern classic, but you have to admit the much anticipated sequel in 1999 outdid it in every way. The animation's better, they introduced new characters, the world gets bigger. Toy Story 2 is even a little bit longer. If you fast forward to Toy Story 3, it actually does a great job closing out the Toy Story. It started with Andy as a child playing with the toys and ends with him as an adult. And the third movie is where Toy Story should have ended. Just ask Quentin Tarantino. He'll tell you the same thing. Toy Story 3 might be an exception to that third movie curse. Along with Star Wars, Toy Story actually needed 3 movies to tell the full story. And because it's now a Disney franchise, they're just going to keep making more and more Toy Story movies. Tom Hanks is going to be voicing Woody till he's 90.
Disney brought him back. They're going to make him do this till he's 90.
Speaking of 90s, another post-90s exception to the rule is the Matrix trilogy. Even though the first movie could actually stand alone as its own masterpiece, there was a lot more story to be told, so we got parts 2 and 3. Also, the Lord of the Rings trilogy would be an exception. Obviously, 3 movies were necessary because of the huge story it was telling. It could actually be compared to Star Wars in how complete the trilogy feels, But instead of most people remembering the second movie, like with Star Wars, I think Lord of the Rings is most remembered for The Fellowship and maybe Return of the King. Going through the decades of film, it seems like it's a rarity to actually see a trilogy that has one story mapped around 3 different movies, unless it's based on a 3-part book. Usually it's more likely a 2-movie story with an extra 3rd movie that's just for the fans, and maybe a 4th, 5th, and 6th movie just because they got bills to pay and they're running out of ideas. Comedy films like Scary Movie started doing this 4th film, 5th film, 6th film nonsense in the 90s because horror films started doing it. But then you'd have films like the Friday trilogy sticking to the 2 movies plus a 3rd movie rule. In a way, Friday is similar to Lord of the Rings, where the 1st and the 3rd movies are more memorable than the 2nd one. You have the classic 1st movie that can stand on its own, Friday, then next Friday, and then Friday after the next, which could stand by itself as a modern Christmas classic. What makes the 2nd movie of a trilogy or the 1st and 3rd movie of a trilogy stand out is the random scenes that stay in your head, the lines being said, and how quotable they are. Now, comedy-wise, a trilogy that lives rent-free in my head is Rush Hour. It's a perfect example of the trilogy rule, as it usually is. First one's a classic, but the second one manages to be even better, and then there's that 3rd one. Now, why was the first Rush Hour so memorable? It had a buddy cop dynamic that has never been tried before, and till this day hasn't been tried again. And for a good reason, because for a buddy cop film series, you can't top Rush Hour. Don't try it. And please don't try to reboot it. It took the buddy cop genre from the 80s, where you had a black comedian playing one of the cops, Eddie Murphy, and they'd solve a mystery while being funny. They took that concept and put a twist on it, adding Jackie Chan as the other cop, with of course upcoming 90s comedian Chris Tucker. Genius writing, genius plot, just about every scene can be quoted line for line, bar for bar.
What the hell did you just say?
Hang on for about an hour. I'm gonna go get the ambulance. I'll be right back.
What are you doing?
Just hang on, man. I'll be right back.
Wipe yourself off, man. You dead.
Then in 2001, the sequel came out. It was bigger, better, and followed everything that made a good sequel. It took the world of the first movie and expanded on it. I'd say it completely flipped it like a pancake, because now instead of Detective Lee being in Los Angeles with James Carter, Carter was in Hong Kong with Lee. While putting the detectives in each other's shoes over both movies, it goes full circle and tells a whole story. Between 1 and 2, we see the friendship develop and get better over time. Would it be nice to see Lee and Carter again solving another mystery in another movie? Yeah, but it wasn't necessary. 6 years later, Rush Hour 3 came out, and everyone was excited for it, given how good 2 was, but it had a lot to live up to. This time, instead of LA or Hong Kong, they'd be in Paris. But it connects back to their time in LA from the first movie. And despite this 3rd movie not being as successful as the 2nd, it did everything a 3rd movie is expected to do. The 3rd movie took the lead characters to a completely different setting. And while a lot of it might just be rewritten from parts 1 and 2, it finds a way to reconnect to that first movie. Like usually in the 3rd installment, they'll bring in a character you haven't seen since the first installment, or act like something that happened during the events of the first movie led directly into what's happening in the 3rd movie years later. Often what the 3rd movie is trying to do is recapture the magic that the first movie had, but it doesn't quite go well. Either way, it's supposed to have a connection to the original. I'll just use Jurassic Park 3 for an example. While it took place on Isla Sorna, just like The Lost World did, it felt like a completely different island with a completely different group of people and dinosaurs. The only connection to the original Jurassic Park were the two paleontologist characters. The vibe of the third movie always being different could have a lot of reasons behind it. They could have different writers, a different post-production crew, or maybe too much time has passed since the last one and everyone is just off their game. And today, the unwritten rules of the film trilogy still hold up for the most part. 3 movies. The second one's probably your favorite. First one's a classic, and then there's that third one. Just look at the Deadpool trilogy. How long did we have to wait for the third one? Did you notice how different it was from Deadpool 1 and 2? It's almost as if the third Deadpool could just be its own standalone movie. The reasons behind all of that was pretty obvious. The third movie just has to be different. It has to do something the other 2 movies didn't do, while at the same time ending the story and closing the book, or at least closing a chapter. Unless, of course, you're a movie trilogy under Disney, which means the story will probably never end, because you have theme park tickets and merchandise to sell.
Till you're 90.
Like and subscribe to Retro Sick for more random nostalgia and interesting coincidences surrounding said nostalgia, and I will see ya